From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Is he joking?
I've raised a lot of money for the next race that I assume I can't use for myself, but I'm not 100% sure because, I don't know. I think I'm not allowed to run again. I'm not sure. Am I allowed to run again, Mike? I better not get you involved in that argument.
Because he keeps mentioning it.
I have had more people ask me to have a third term, which is in a way a fourth term because the other election, the 2020 election was totally rigged.
Before Trump came to the White House, but after he was elected, I remember talking to a fairly prominent Trump supporter. I was asking her about all the fears that people had about Trump, that he might never leave or that he might assume more powers than the presidency usually has. And she said, well, you don't really have to worry about that because he's only serving one term and he has nothing to prove. So I think there are people within the MAGA following who are taken by surprise by this.
He's only been back a little over 2 months, but US President Donald Trump has already rapidly expanded the reach of executive power. And now, maybe he won't serve his second and constitutionally mandated final term. Could he try for a third?
It sort of depends on whether you look how closely you're going to focus on the language rather than the general meaning and purpose of these two amendments. If you focus only on the text, you can make that argument.
The story today. Could Trump serve a third term? Can we start, Will, with the easy question? Both your names and who you are.
My name's Will Pavia, and I'm a New York correspondent for The Times.
Will, this whole Donald Trump maybe seeking a third term thing has crept up on a lot of us. I don't know if it has on you. When did your ears first start to prick up to mention of this?
So he gave an interview to NBC, and the strange thing about the interview was that they didn't record it for whatever reason.
President Trump called me this morning. We discussed a range of topics, including the possibility of him serving a third term. He's joked about it.
And so we had Kristen Welker, the presenter, sort of talking about what Trump had said to her. It was sort of secondhand in a way.
He told me he's not joking. He said there are methods by which you could do it, but he said it's far too early to think about it. He said he's focused on his current job.
And actually, towards the end of the day, Trump was at Mar-a-Lago and he flew home on Air Force One or flew back to Washington, D.C. And there were reporters on the plane and they sort of asked him about it and said, is this right?
You said you were not joking about a third term, about possibly wanting a third term. Does that mean you're not planning to leave office on January 20th?
I'm not looking at that, but I'll tell you, I have had more people ask me to have a third term, which is in a way a fourth term because the other election, the 2020 election was totally rigged.
And he sort of basically said the same thing again, but this time to the press who all took it down.
I want to talk about a third term now because no matter how you look at it, we got a long time to go. We have a long time. You know, we have almost 4 years to go. And that's a long time. But despite that, so many people are saying, you've got to run again. They love the job we're doing. Most importantly, they love the job we're doing.
Sort of saying, you know, that no, it wasn't a joke, but he had bigger things to focus on for the moment. So that was sort of the beginnings of all this in a sense.
What are some of the people around him saying?
Well, so, I mean, Steve Bannon, who was his sort of first-time White House strategist and is still a sort of influential figure, he said that he thought that the Republican Party and the sort of MAGA movement was never going to have someone as talented as Trump. And so they needed to take advantage of it.
A man like this comes along once every century if we're lucky. We've got him now. He's on fire, and I'm a huge supporter. Want to see him again in 2028.
You're a smart guy. Oh, you know he's term limited. How do you think he gets another term?
We're working on it. I think we'll have a couple of alternatives. Let's say that.
There's also a Tennessee Republican congressman who introduced a sort of bill or resolution to change the rules on this. And he essentially said the same thing, that we have this great figure in President Trump. We may never get someone as gifted as this in our lifetimes.
But even these flirtations with the idea of changing or jumping over the limits in the Constitution to give him a third term in office, it's not completely out of character, is it? Donald Trump is somebody who for a long time has admired autocrats who don't necessarily have to bother with elections.
Well, this is true. I mean, there's a famous case in his first term after Xi Jinping removed the limits set by the Chinese Communist Party. And Trump sort of said that he thought it was great and perhaps it should be something that we should look at. He sort of said it, to his own supporters, and it was always seen as this sort of way to rile up the media. And whenever he says it at his rallies, I mean, he would sort of, say, maybe we'll do 2 terms or 3 terms or 4.
It will be the greatest honor of my life to serve not once, but twice, or 3 times, or 4 times.
He sort of suggested that he was just throwing a little bit of red meat to the journalists at the back, the fake news journalists, as he would call them.
Headlines from the fake news.
But it was one of those things where, he does have this habit of moving the Overton window, the sort of window of what might be accepted in the political discourse, by sort of joking about it first and then continuing to talk about it. I mean, this time around, the obvious examples of things like perhaps Canada should be the 51st state, or perhaps we should take back control of the Panama Canal, or perhaps Greenland should become a state. I mean, a lot of those things just seemed completely crazy. But then he talks about it and people say, oh no. And his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, she was asked at some point about, this was after Trump and Netanyahu had met at the White House, and Trump had talked about how they should redevelop the Gaza Strip and make it the Gaza Riviera. She was asked about, is this really a plan of Trump's?
On the foreign partners, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis have already panned this plan. What foreign partners, if any, have expressed any interest in being part of it?
She said he's been socialing it for a while.
Well, the president has said he's been socialing this idea for quite some time. He's been thinking about this. He said in his remarks last night, this was not a decision or an announcement that he takes lightly.
Which I never heard that term, but I think what she meant was he's been talking to people about it that he meets and seeing what people think of the idea. And that's sort of how he tests out new potential policies. He says, well, what if we did this? And just sees what sticks. That is sort of seems to be his way of operating.
Flying a kite, as people would say in UK politics, seeing what happens to it. Do we know where Americans generally stand on this?
So there was a YouGov survey a few weeks ago on this question, and 60% of Americans are against the idea of him seeking another term, but 56% thought he would have a shot at it.
Which is incredible.
Yes. I suppose you're looking at somebody who tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election, who has sort of expanded the powers of the presidency in his first weeks in office. People are constantly worried about a constitutional crisis. And so I think, those Americans who may not necessarily be paying attention to everything he does, but they probably have a sense of him. You could argue that they probably quite sensibly think that he might try to seek another term, even if it's barred by the Constitution.
But is it barred?
I am Suzanna Sherry. I am the Herman R. Loewenstein Professor of Law Emerita at Vanderbilt University, and one of my specialties is constitutional law and constitutional history.
Donald Trump has been teasing this idea of a third term. You're here to help us explain and explore what the Constitution has to say about all of this. First of all, if we rewind all the way to the beginning of the Union, 250 years or so ago, did the framers put any language into the original Constitution about term limits?
No, they did not. There was nothing in the original Constitution that limited a president to however many terms he wanted.
And so George Washington, the first president, wildly popular, could have continued as long as he wanted?
Yes, pretty much. It was pretty clear he could have run for and won a third term and possibly a fourth. And in fact, a lot of people pressed him to run, but he said that 2 terms was enough. He wanted to go back to private life, and he also thought it would not be a good idea for the country to have a very long running presidency. So he stepped down and went back to farming at that Mount Vernon.
Yes. And did any presidents after him veer off that course of thinking?
Well, until FDR, none actually ran. But Ulysses S. Grant, who served right after the Civil War, he won in 1868 and he ran again and won in 1872. He toyed with running for a third term, but he was talked out of it, and partly because of health reasons and partly because he was following Washington's example and the example of all the presidents before him. But he did toy with it at least.
Someone else did more than toy with it, who you mentioned there, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He ended up running and winning 4 times. How did that happen? Tell us about that.
So he was elected first in 1932 in the middle of the Depression, and again in 1936 when we were still deep in the Depression. And when he ran in 1940, the Depression was easing, but it wasn't over. Plus, we were almost certainly gearing up for war. It wasn't clear whether we were going to enter World War II, but it looked like we were. And he was still very popular. And so he decided, and the country decided, that they didn't want to change presidents. And then, of course, when he ran in 1944, we were in the middle of a war. And again, the country didn't want to change presidents. He didn't end up serving his full 4th term, of course, because he died in office.
Was there, though, during those 3rd and 4th campaigns, much disquiet at that point about this norm-busting, tradition-busting electoral run?
There was opposition from the Republicans, of course, and I think that they used that. They suggested that he shouldn't run again or he shouldn't be elected again because, after all, he would be the first president to ever serve more than 2 terms. But it was political. It was just part of the campaign, and he was so popular that it didn't make much difference. But the Republican Congress, as soon as the Congress turned Republican after 1946, they almost immediately proposed the 22nd Amendment. They proposed it in 1947, which says that no president can be elected to more than 2 terms.
And how much of a faff was that? I mean, getting this 22nd Amendment on the, I don't know, is it statute book, on the Constitution? Is that quite a feat?
Well, there's only been 27 amendments to the Constitution, and the first 10 of them were ratified and proposed and ratified all at once. That's our Bill of Rights. So it is very difficult to get an amendment enacted. It takes 3/4 of the states to ratify it. This one took about 4 years. It was proposed in 1947, and it was ratified by 3/4 of the states by 1951. So that's 4 years, which is certainly not the fastest amendment that has ever been passed or ratified, but it's not the slowest either. But I think most people agreed that perhaps Roosevelt should be unique, given the Depression and the war, that they didn't expect any other president would need to serve that many terms.
You've already hinted at its wording. Do you have it in front of you, the 22nd Amendment?
I do.
Go on, read it.
It's pretty long. I'm not going to read the whole thing.
Okay, give us the highlights.
The relevant part of it is no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice. And then it goes on to talk about what would happen if somebody took office because the president died or resigned or whatever, what would happen, how many terms that person could serve, and then it set a time limit for ratification. But again, the most important wording is no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice.
The wording of that seems pretty watertight. To your mind, is there a lot of wiggle room that could be had?
There's not a lot of wiggle room, but there is a little bit of wiggle room.
Professor Sho, we're talking about, well, the prospect of something that Donald Trump has been toying with out loud, the idea of him running for a third term, which, as you've explained, is forbidden in the Constitution because of the 22nd Amendment. One thing, though, that Trump's allies have been suggesting and floating is this idea that could you have somebody well on board with the Trump project, like J.D. Vance, actually run as the president in 2028, with Trump as the vice president, and then your pliable President J.D. Vance would step down after inauguration, and would you believe it, Donald Trump is back for a third term through a sort of backdoor. Is there any possibility in that, any legal rationale?
Well, the strongest argument is no. That is, the strongest argument is that the purpose and meaning of the 22nd Amendment is that nobody should serve as president for more than 2 terms. But the language is a little different. The language says no person shall be elected to the office of president. And so then the question is, well, there are other ways to become president besides being elected. And one way would be to be elected vice president, and then the president steps down and the vice president would become president. So the question is, can he run for vice president? And here we have the 12th Amendment, which simply says at the end of it, it's again a long, complicated amendment, but it simply says no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president. So there's a mismatch between the language of the 22nd Amendment, which says he can't be elected for a third term, and the language of the 12th Amendment, which says he can't serve as vice president if he's not eligible to be president. That is, if he's not eligible to the office of president. And that mismatch leaves a tiny little argument that says he can't run for president, but he's not ineligible to be president, and therefore he's not ineligible to be vice president.
Do you think that's the argument Trump might use?
I think that's the only argument he can use.
Do you think that that is a wide enough gap, though, to make any kind of progress? Or is it really splitting hairs?
I think it's a losing argument. I think most judges, including at least most of the justices of the Supreme Court, would think it's a losing argument. But it sort of depends on whether you look, how closely you're going to focus on the language rather than the general meaning and purpose of these 2 amendments. If you focus only on the text, you can make that argument.
What would be, in an ideal world, Donald Trump's clearest path to being able to run for a third term? If everything could go his way, I mean, are there mechanisms in which you could just get rid of the 22nd Amendment?
Oh, yes. The 22nd Amendment could be repealed by amendment. That is, Congress could propose a new amendment repealing the 22nd Amendment, or language that says a president can run for a third term. The language wouldn't matter. And then that would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That's only been done once. The 18th Amendment was prohibition. That is, it made the sale of alcohol illegal throughout the country. And the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. But so an amendment can be repealed. It goes through the same process as it went through to be enacted, but it's perfectly fine to repeal it. But it seems very unlikely. Congress might propose that. In fact, I believe a member of Congress, I think my member of Congress,
Hmm.
has already proposed it. But I don't think it's going to go anywhere in Congress. And I'm sure it won't be ratified by 3/4 of the states in time for the election, if at all.
The divisive nature of US politics at the moment would sort of prohibit that.
Yes, I think so.
What about another option which is put out there, which is what some people were worrying about when he lost the 2020 election, was what if he just doesn't leave? What if he enacts martial law and maybe, I don't know, the military is more pliable this time round. Now he's been able to get rid of a few people. He could just bluster on through.
That would be a constitutional crisis of incredible magnitude. I just can't imagine that. I think that's everybody's nightmare, is that he simply won't leave.
Hmm.
I don't think he would do that. But there's, as you say, if the military is on his side and the courts would say he can't stay, but they can't enforce that without the help of the US Marshals. That is, somebody would actually have to remove him from the White House.
Hmm.
And if it's not the military, it would have to be the US Marshals who enforce court orders. But the US Marshals are part of the executive branch, and he can order them not to remove him. But it would take, I mean, he would have to go along with it. The military would have to go along with it. It would be a coup. I
Hmm.
mean, that's what it would be. I don't think any of this is really going to happen for a whole lot of reasons, including that I don't think he wants that fight. I mean, he's going to be, what, in his mid 80s by the time this term is over? And in terms of doing the switcheroo with the vice president, I don't know why Vance would agree to that, or if he did agree to it, why he would step down after being elected. So I think it is very far fetched. And I am much more concerned with some of the things that Trump is doing now, because they have real world effects, and the courts are stopping some of it, and then the Supreme Court is not stopping some of it. So I'm much more concerned about the things that Trump is doing now than I am about the possibility that he might defy the 22nd Amendment and a court enforcement of the 22nd Amendment. He might defy some court orders now, but I don't think he would defy that one.
Well, thinking about all these comments from Donald Trump about what he might do about a third term, which he is currently, as we've been hearing, prohibited from doing, it all fits into a theme of this second presidency that critics like to draw a line through. Yes, he's toying with the idea of a third term, and also he's doing all these other things to consolidate power. What kind of things?
Well, so he has majorities in both houses of Congress, and he has 6 conservative or Republican appointed judges on the Supreme Court out of 9. So he sort of has, it seems, a fairly firm sort of grip both over Congress and over the Supreme Court, in as much as he has judges sympathetic to his stances, perhaps. And in these first 2 months, he just hasn't seemed to have had any check really on his power. He's issued all these executive orders, just an absolute blizzard of them, 100 in his first 100 days. And he has not really had much pushback from Congress. So, Elon Musk and Doge have been firing all these civil servants and grappling agencies that were set up by Congress, and also sort of countermanding spending that had been approved or appropriated by Congress. And his Republicans in Congress have proved so far fairly pliant in terms of not really opposing anything that he's doing. Of course, the Democrats are going crazy, but the Republicans have more or less gone along with it. They know that they could face a primary challenge if they try and stand in his way. So there's been very few voices in Congress raised in opposition to the president in terms of assuming these powers. I mean, the tariffs is another example where they're using a sort of an act in order to assume these sort of powers. There's a legal debate about whether or not they should have. There are these fears that there'll be a standoff with the courts and that essentially the White House will ignore what the court says. So, yeah, all of this is very much in the air, this sense of that the president will get his way at the moment.
And you mentioned that Congress and his Republican members are so pliant, it seems, at the moment. There are some, though, who are absolutely frothing at the prospect of Trump being able to run in a third term. Your man who you mentioned a little bit earlier on, who's drafted a bill hoping to bring that to effect.
Yeah, so Congressman Andy Ogles of Tennessee has drafted this bill. He has been a hugely supportive voice, in favor of Trump sort of saying that judges should be impeached and that nobody should stand in the way of Elon Musk in the changes that he's bringing about. His bill, he says, is sort of drafted specifically, or rather his resolution is drafted to ensure that someone like Trump, well, he specifically says someone like Trump comes along, once every century. Once every century, you have a president who is elected and then loses power and then is elected again. And I mean, he's right. That hasn't happened since the 1920s. So it's specifically drafted for somebody who serves 2 non-consecutive terms, could then serve a third. So he's thinking specifically about Trump when he writes this. But it's not really plausible that he could get this through Congress because Republicans don't have enough control. I mean, you need 2/3 of the House, you need 2/3 of the Senate. The Republicans are a long way from that. They've got these very slim majorities. And then you would need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. And again, I mean, there isn't 3/4 of the states who would be in favor of this. So it does seem like a pretty unlikely thing for anyone to hope for.
Just finally, Will, the former House Speaker Newt Gingrich was quoted in one of the papers of the day saying, this isn't really an issue, all this third term stuff. It's the talk of cocktail parties. It's almost like a parlour game, he's trying to say. Do you take any of this seriously, or what Donald Trump says about this seriously, or not?
I mean, I do think there's an element of that it's a distraction. He's very good at throwing these things up that he knows will drive liberals crazy and that will drive the press crazy. And, as we're running into these enormous tariffs that he was about to bring in, it's a good sort of distraction. It also makes him sound great, which he is not something that he's ever minded necessarily. And I certainly think that there must be part of him that worries about being a lame duck, especially when you get to sort of next year and the midterms. And if the Republicans don't do very well, there'll be a sense that Trump is on the way out. And that is never good for your power and your hold over all these people. You can imagine that some of his power will start to wane and people will start to look to the next person. And that's something that he just wants to avoid for as long as possible, I think. And so I think talking about this sort of serves its own purpose. And it's just how seriously the rest of us can take it, really.
Just keep them guessing until you're ready to go.
Exactly.
Will Pavia, New York correspondent for The Times, and earlier we heard from Professor Suzanna Sherry of Vanderbilt University in the US. If you're after a bit of a break from Trump news, Will, interestingly, got his hands on some never-before-seen letters by Jack Kerouac, which are now going for £250,000 a pop, where Kerouac wonders if an unpunctuated stream of consciousness novel he's just written whilst high on amphetamines might possibly sell. We'll put a link to that story in the notes of this episode. That is it from us today. Today's episode was produced by Taryn Siegel, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.